discover the moving story of Zacchaeus, the tax collector who climbed a tree to see Jesus and ended up receiving much more than he bargained for. In this video, we will explore how Zacchaeus' encounter with Christ transformed his life and his heart, leading him to pay back 4 times as much to those from whom he had unjustly charged. Follow us to understand the powerful lessons of faith, conversion, and generosity that this story teaches us, and how we can apply them in our lives today. Subscribe to the channel for more exciting biblical stories, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. If you like the content, don't forget to send a thanks a lot. And if you want to support the channel even more, become a member and gain access to exclusive benefits. Zacchaeus, a name that many knew, but few they spoke with respect. He was not well-liked, not among the people of Jericho. He was a tax collector, and even worse, their boss. For many, Zacchaeus was a symbol of greed and injustice, small in stature, but great in power. He was part of a hated elite, rich at the expense of other people's suffering. Every coin he took from others seemed to add to the weight of his own soul. But, curiously, all this wealth and status did not bring him the peace he sought so much. Behind the facade of power and influence, there was a void that money could not fill. Maybe it was people's contemptuous looks, or the silent conscience that disturbed him on lonely nights. Zacchaeus was surrounded by riches, but his heart remained restless. Something inside him wanted more. No more money, no more power. Something different, something he couldn't explain. It was then that a buzz began to circulate through the streets of Jericho. Jesus, the man everyone was talking about, was passing through town. They said he was a prophet, a healer, perhaps even the Messiah. Zacchaeus had heard about the miracles, the words of wisdom, but he didn't know what to think. However, something inside him lit up, a curiosity, a need to see this man up close. Maybe, just maybe, by meeting Jesus, he could understand what was missing in his life. The news traveled quickly, like the wind through the narrow streets of Jericho. Jesus was on his way, and the entire city seemed to have woken up to this event. The uproar grew every moment. Merchants closed their stores, families left their homes, and everyone wanted to see the man who healed the blind, raised the paralyzed, and spoke about a kingdom unlike any other. Zacchaeus, even in the midst of his worries and dilemmas, could not ignore what was happening. He had already heard many stories about Jesus. He heard about the fisherman Simon, who abandoned everything to follow him, about the woman who touched his clothes and was healed. But until then, all of this seemed too far away. Jesus was always in another place, in another city. Now, however, he was there, and what was a simple curiosity turned into something bigger. A desire was growing inside Zacchaeus, something he hadn't felt in a long time. He needed to see Jesus, needed to look into his eyes. But the more Zacchaeus thought about it, the clearer the obstacle became. He was small, and the crowd that was already beginning to form in the streets would not give him space. Nobody would give him a place. On the contrary, all would avoid. How could he, Zacchaeus, a despised man, see the one everyone wanted to find? It was as if the universe was conspiring against him. But inside him, curiosity became a flame. He couldn't give up so easily. The street was packed with people. The sound of voices, the noise of hurried footsteps, the commotion coming from all directions. It was impossible to get through the crowd. Zacchaeus, with his short stature, could barely see what was happening in front of him. He was stretched. I tried to look between people's shoulders, but it was useless. Increasingly frustrated, he realized that he simply would not have a chance to see Jesus in that crowd. The destination seemed playing with him, once again reminding him of his limitations. But Zacchaeus was not a man to accept defeats easily. Looking around, his mind began to work. He needed to find a way. It was then that he saw a fig tree on the side of the path, with strong branches high enough to give him a privileged view. The plan was simple. If he couldn't see Jesus from the ground, they believed from above. Without thinking twice, Zacchaeus ran to the tree. Such an important man, used to commanding, did not hesitate to go up. He climbed with the dexterity of someone who knew what he wanted, ignoring the looks of surprise or contempt from those who recognized him. A man of his position, subjecting himself to such an act, was a rare thing to see. But Zacchaeus didn't care what they thought. He was focused on one thing: seeing Jesus. From above, finally installed on a sturdy branch, he could see everything: the buzz of the crowd, the anxious looks, and in the distance, the man he so wanted to see. Jesus was approaching. It was a strange, almost childish feeling to be in that place. A man so powerful, known and feared by all, now hanging from a tree like a curious child. But he didn't think about that. His only focus was Jesus, and now he saw him. The crowd was excited around him. Everyone tried to get closer, touch him, hear his words. Jesus walked slowly, with a serenity that contrasted with the chaos around him. Zacchaeus, for a moment, forgot where he was. He was so mesmerized by the figure of Jesus that nothing else seemed to matter. That man, who barely knew him, already caused a profound change in his heart just with his presence. Zacchaeus expected nothing more than a brief glimpse from afar, a memory he would keep with him. This was what he thought would be the end of his journey that day. But then, something surprising happened. Jesus stopped, right under the tree where Zacchaeus was. The crowd also stopped, curious, confused. Jesus' eyes lifted and met Zacchaeus's. In that instant, time seemed to slow down. Zacchaeus couldn't believe it. Of all the places Jesus could have gone, he stopped right there, under the tree where Zacchaeus hid among the branches. Jesus' eyes lifted, fixing him. That look, something about him was different. It wasn't just curiosity. It was as if Jesus already knew everything about him, as if he knew his story, his mistakes, his fears, his deepest flaws. And at the same time, that look didn't have a hint of judgment. For a few moments, Zacchaeus remained motionless, not knowing what to do. His heartbeat was so loud he could hear it like a drum. He wondered, why is Jesus looking at me? Is he going to confront me here, in front of everyone? The crowd also fell silent, waiting for what would come next. It was as if time had stopped. All eyes, all expectations, were now focused on that unexpected scene. It was then that Jesus, with the same calmness that he showed in all his gestures, called, "Zacchaeus, come down quickly." Those words, spoken so naturally, took him by surprise. Jesus called him by name. How could he know? Nobody had said anything. Zacchaeus was there, hidden, almost like a silent spectator of Jesus passing. But Jesus saw it. Jesus knew him. Before Zacchaeus could process everything, Jesus continued, "Today I must stay at your house." Zacchaeus' world seemed to have turned upside down with those words. Jesus, the man most admired by everyone, not only called him by name, but said he would come to his house. Surprise took over Zacchaeus. No one had ever wanted to enter his house. He, the chief tax collector, seen as a traitor and sinner, now received an invitation from Jesus himself. It wasn't just any invitation. It was a gesture of deep acceptance. He who everyone considered holy, pure, worthy, wanted to be with him, the most despised among the people. The crowd murmured. People whispered among themselves in shock. "What do you mean? Jesus is going to the house of a sinner?" They said in a reproachful tone. It was impossible to hide the disbelief on the faces of many. In the eyes of the crowd, Zacchaeus did not deserve such an honor. How could someone like him, who exploited his own people, be worthy of welcoming Jesus into his home? The whispers grew louder, and the weight of judgment was palpable. But Jesus seemed oblivious to all this. He didn't care about appearances, what they said. His focus was on Zacchaeus, on that man that everyone judged, but that he saw differently. There was something deeper, something that Jesus saw beyond riches and mistakes. Zacchaeus, still stunned, hurried down from the tree. What was going through your mind at that moment? His heart beat faster as he prepared to receive the man who, with just a few words, had already deeply touched his soul. And so, with the path opened by Jesus, they set off towards the house of Zacchaeus. The news that Jesus would go to Zacchaeus' house spread quickly, like a whirlwind that passes by and shakes everything around. The crowd, already perplexed by the attention that Jesus had given to the chief tax collector, could not believe what was happening. People whispered among themselves. Their looks were full of disapproval. "How can you?" some murmured. "Is he going to stay with a sinner?" Others questioned in an indignant tone. That scene was almost ironic. Zacchaeus, the man everyone avoided, now had everyone's attention. But this attention was not admiration. On the contrary, he felt the weight of judgment in people's eyes. The tax collector, always accustomed to being ignored, was now in the midst of much criticism. People wondered what Jesus was doing. Wasn't this the man who spoke of love and justice? How could he associate with someone who robbed his own people? But Jesus, as always, did not allow himself to be carried away by the expectations of the crowd. He walked alongside Zacchaeus, as if nothing else mattered. His presence was enough to silence external voices and bring peace to Zacchaeus, who was still trying to understand everything that was happening. Zacchaeus' mind was buzzing. What would that meeting be like? What did Jesus want from him? Why did he choose the home of such a despised man? With a racing heart and full of questions, Zacchaeus guided Jesus to his home, not knowing that that visit would change his life in a way he could never imagine. Zacchaeus opened the doors to his house with shaking hands. He, who was used to living among luxury and wealth, now felt small compared to the person he had just welcomed into his home. Jesus entered calmly, without rushing, observing everything around him. The atmosphere in the house was different, as if the air itself was charged with a silent tension. There were the most hated man in the city and the most admired man, together, face to face. The contrast between them was stark, but Jesus didn't seem to see it that way. Sitting at the table, dinner began. Zacchaeus' servants, who also did not hide their surprise, served the food with quick hands and curious looks. The conversation flowed simply. We don't know exactly what was said at that dinner, but we can imagine the impact those words had on Zacchaeus. Jesus, with his unique way of speaking, probably did not confront him with direct accusations. Instead, his words should be full of understanding and mercy, as if saying, "I know who you are, I know what you did, but I'm here because you're important to me." Zacchaeus, who previously lived surrounded by material wealth, now felt that something much more valuable was present at the table. Every word of Jesus touched a deep spot in his soul, making him review every decision, every coin he had made dishonestly. Zacchaeus' heart, hardened by years of greed, began to break. Something inside him was changing. Zacchaeus could barely contain the mix of feelings that were stirring within him. As Jesus spoke, each word seemed to penetrate the deepest layers of his consciousness. It was as if, suddenly, all the riches and all the power he had accumulated over the years no longer meant anything. The opulence of his house, the coins piled in his coffers, everything seemed to lose value in the presence of Jesus. It was then that, with an uncontrollable impulse, Zacchaeus stood up. His voice, filled with new conviction, filled the room. "Lord, I give half of my goods to the poor." The words came out with an urgency that surprised even himself. The man who was once known for his greed was now willing to give up much of his fortune. But he didn't stop there. With his eyes fixed on Jesus, he continued, "And if I stole something from someone, I will give it back 4 times as much." Those words resonated in the environment, leaving everyone in silence. The promise that Zacchaeus had just made was great. Paying back 4 times what he had extorted was an exorbitant amount, a sacrifice few would be willing to make. But Zacchaeus was determined. Something had radically changed within him. He didn't just want to redeem himself. "I wanted to fix what I had broken, to repair the injustices I had caused." And as he stood, still panting from his own statement, Jesus' eyes shone with approval. Zacchaeus remained there, standing, still feeling the impact of the words he had just spoken. Never in his entire life had he imagined making such a radical decision. That man, known for his greed and thirst for wealth, was now willing to give up everything to correct the mistakes of the past. And why is that? What had led Zacchaeus to such a transformation? It was as if, in just a few moments in the presence of Jesus, something in his heart had been completely turned upside down. The change didn't come from external pressure, but from within, from a need he didn't even know existed. Money, which was once his only purpose, now seemed insignificant compared to the peace and forgiveness he felt flowing from Jesus' gaze. It was as if the walls that Zacchaeus had built around himself with his riches were, one by one, crumbling. He looked around. The people in the house were silent, still processing what are over to listen. It was evident that no one expected such an extreme attitude from a man like Zacchaeus. But Jesus' expression remained calm, filled with deep understanding. The generosity that flowed from Zacchaeus was not just a material decision. It was a reflection of a much greater change, a transformation that began in the heart. Zacchaeus knew that his life would never be the same. He clearly felt that Jesus was not just there to visit his home. He had come to change everything, to bring light where there was once darkness. Jesus, looking at Zacchaeus with a gentle smile, raised his voice and said, "Today salvation has come to this house." Those words, simple and direct, resonated with indescribable strength. It wasn't just a statement. It was an affirmation that something extraordinary had happened there, at that moment, inside that house. Salvation, which many thought was reserved for the righteous and perfect, had reached the most unlikely man in Jericho. The people around could hardly believe what they were hearing. Salvation for Zacchaeus? The man everyone despised, who had spent years exploiting the people, was now the target of God's grace? This seemed impossible. But Jesus did not see the outside. He looked at the heart, and Zacchaeus' heart, once hardened by greed, was now completely transformed. He was a new person. And it wasn't just Zacchaeus who was being impacted. Your home, your family, everyone around you would feel the effects of this change. The chief tax collector, the man who accumulated wealth at the expense of others, now became an example of redemption and generosity. Salvation had crossed the door of his house and established itself there, like a light that no one could extinguish. Zacchaeus felt this. Each word of Jesus penetrated even deeper into his soul. He didn't know what the future held, but he was sure of one thing. Nothing would be the same again. Jesus had brought something that no money could buy. From that moment on, Zacchaeus' life took a completely different direction. The man who once lived to accumulate wealth and power was now transformed, guided by a new purpose. He, who had been rejected by society, found in Jesus an acceptance that he had never experienced before, and that acceptance set him free. It freed him from greed, the weight of guilt, and the emptiness that haunted him, despite all his wealth. Not only did Zacchaeus talk about giving half of his possessions to the poor and making fourfold reparations for what he had unjustly taken, he actually kept his promises. His home, once known as a symbol of dishonestly obtained opulence, has become a place of sharing, justice, and renewal. Zacchaeus discovered that true value was not in gold or silver, but in the kindness, compassion, and grace he had received and now wanted to spread. Jesus, by bringing salvation to the house of Zacchaeus, showed everyone that redemption is possible for anyone, regardless of their past or their mistakes. Zacchaeus' transformation was living proof that no one is beyond the reach of divine mercy. His heart, previously hardened, now beat in tune with love and justice. But what can we learn from the story of Zacchaeus? His life invites us to reflect on the changes we are capable of making, on what really matters and how. Even in the deepest darkness, there is always a chance to start over. Just like Zacchaeus, we can all have an encounter that transforms our path. But the question is, are we prepared to open our hearts and respond to this call? Sometimes, it is necessary to strip off our pride, our masks, and do something we would never do to achieve true transformation. When Jesus looked at Zacchaeus, he did not see a corrupt man, but someone with the potential to change. And the most impressive thing is that Jesus did not demand anything from Zacchaeus. Just his presence and the call were enough for Zacchaeus voluntarily to decide to do something extraordinary. Returning what he had stolen and giving half of his possessions to the poor was a grand gesture, But what really marked him was what this act represented: the complete surrender of his life to a new purpose. This story teaches us that great changes begin in the heart, from the inside out. It was not wealth that Zacchaeus abandoned, but his attachment to it, his desire to control his own life through material things. He discovered that there is something infinitely more valuable: peace of mind, justice, and a relationship with the divine. Each of us, in our own way, carries something that we need to leave behind to live fully. The story of Zacchaeus makes us reflect. What still prevents us from experiencing a complete transformation? If you like Zacchaeus' story and want to continue following other stories of faith and overcoming, be sure to like this video and share it with those you love. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new content. Together, let's explore more powerful lessons from the Bible.